For my project, I'm going to explain the macroeconomic equilibrium, how it changes throughout time in the economy, and how it can be fixed using fiscal policy. In the economy, the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph is used to measure and determine changes in price level in the economy and real gross domestic product, or GDP. GDP is the measure of all final goods and services produced in the economy and consists of consumer spending, government spending, net exports, and investment. There are two types of aggregate supply, long run and short run. In the short run, the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping because of a lag of wage and price changes. The sticky wage theory and sticky price theory explain what happens in the short run to the aggregate supply. The sticky wage theory says that as price levels change and wages stay the same, the supply curve will move. For example, if the price level is 100 and contracts sell at $25 per hour wages, but then the price level rises to 105, the firm will increase production and price level and quantity produced will increase. This all happens because the wages stuck and the supply curve moved right. The sticky price theory refers to menu costs, costs associated with catalogs, price tags, and changing values. If a company sends out their catalog, pricing their items according to the current price level, and the price level falls, producers will have extra inventory because it will not sell, and they will therefore need to cut costs and produce less. On the other hand, in the long run, wages and prices adjust to economic changes and always return to full employment equilibrium, making the long-run aggregate supply curve vertical at full employment equilibrium, as opposed to the positively sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. The point on the graph where long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand all meet is the equilibrium. The equilibrium is 3% CPI and 5% unemployment. There are three ways which this graph can be altered: inflation, recession, and stagflation. There are two types of inflation: cost push and demand pull. Cost push inflation is caused by an increase in input costs through the economy, causing aggregate supply to increase. Inflation makes aggregate demand shift right, therefore increasing GDP and price level. For example, if there's an increase in wages, this will increase input costs and therefore increase aggregate supply. Demand pull inflation happens when the demand for goods and services increases when the production of these goods and services is already high. The increase in aggregate demand causes real GDP to expand and price level to increase. In either case, the inflation causes aggregate demand curve to shift right because the price level and quantity of real GDP both increase. This creates an inflationary gap in the economy. One example of cost push inflation is when gas prices go up because oil is getting harder and harder to obtain. People can't buy less gas because they still have to do the same amount of driving as they did when gas prices were lower. Therefore, as the supply of gas decreases, the demand stays the same. An example of demand pull inflation is when the demand for laptops increases. If every school required students to bring their own laptop, the demand for laptops would increase. As a result of the strong consumer demand, when many people are trying to purchase the same good, the price will inevitably increase. This happens for all goods throughout the entire economy. Using fiscal policy to influence the economy can be done one of two ways. Fiscal policy is the use of government revenue to make change in the economy. This can be done through changing either taxation or government spending. Fiscal policy can be either expansionary or contractionary. In the case of inflation, the government would most likely choose a contractionary policy in an attempt to bring GDP back down to price and QRGDP equilibrium. A contractionary fiscal policy would require the government to either increase taxes or decrease government spending. Increasing taxes would give consumers less money to spend. If consumers have less money in their pockets, consumer spending will decrease and GDP will decrease. This will close the inflationary gap. Another contractionary fiscal policy that the government has is to decrease government spending. Since government spending is another one of the components of GDP, decreasing it will decrease GDP altogether. Either one of these fiscal policies will close the inflationary gap and bring price level and quantity of the real GDP back down to equilibrium. The opposite problem of inflation is recession. In a recession, price level decreases and quantity real GDP decreases. Contrary to inflation, a recession causes the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. For this problem, the government would most likely choose an expansionary policy to increase GDP and increase price level to close the recessionary gap and bring the economy back to equilibrium. Expansionary fiscal policy, or a policy that is meant to increase GDP, would either be a decrease in taxes or an increase in government spending. A decrease in taxes would give consumers more money in their pocket. This would then lead to more consumer spending, increasing GDP. If the government were to increase government spending, this would also cause GDP to rise due to the rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve. The third problem in the economy is stagflation. Stagflation describes the economy when prices are high, but GDP is low. The stagflationary gap is caused by a decrease in the short-run aggregate supply curve because input costs are increasing while prices are still increasing and GDP decreases. Fiscal policy can only shift the aggregate demand curve, so there is a trade-off for picking either expansionary or contractionary fiscal policy. Fixing stagflation with an expansionary fiscal policy by either increasing government spending or decreasing taxes would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Since the problem with stagflation is the short-run aggregate supply curve, increasing aggregate demand would increase GDP, which would help the economy, but at the same time it would increase prices even more than before, which is a trade-off of an expansionary policy. On the other hand, a contractionary fiscal policy could also be used to try and fix stagflation. By either decreasing government spending or increasing taxes, aggregate demand would decrease and shift to the left. This change would also cause prices to drop, which is a positive effect of this policy, but it would cause GDP to decrease, which is a trade-off.